I'm Nabil, I'll be your host for this evening. I'll give a very quick intro to the Essence for Agility Meetup, just for those who are joining us for the first time. So Essence for Agility is a community that's been around for about 1.5 years now. And as you guessed, it's to explore Essence, which is a standard that aims to describe all practices within agile methods in order so that we can better pick the right set of practices to suit our context, regardless of which method they belong to, and also design bespoke ways of working and to free the practices from the method prisons, as some of us poetically put it. So we discuss matters related to Essence, and we'll also discuss general topics within Agile. And tonight I am very pleased to say that we have 3 brilliant guests with us, and I will give you a quick introduction about each of them, although I'm sure I'll do the rich careers little justice, but in no particular order. On our panel tonight, we have Steve Freeman, who was once a pioneer of the Agile movement in the UK and a co-chair of the first London XP Day. He's also the co-author of The Growing Object-Oriented Software, a standard text on iterative software development. Steve likes to spend his time helping teams deliver better, and he also still likes to code, which is awesome. Up next, we have Joseph Pellerin. He's an experienced psychologist and agilist with an excellent track record in helping companies improve by optimizing the way they work. Interesting tidbit, he was also one of the first Scrum trainers in Europe. So we have him partly to thank to Scrum's prevalence in Europe.
It's my fault.
So if you want to blame him, you absolutely can, and now's your opportunity. And last but not least, Rebecca Wurst, I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's best known as the design geek who invented responsibility-driven design and the X-driven meme. You can think TDD, BDD, DDD. She's also keen on discovering and sharing heuristics, patterns, and practices for reducing risk and sustainable ongoing agile development. So that's a little sneak peek into our 3 lovely panelists. But before we go on to some questions for them, we have Eva, who will be saying a few words as well.
Thank you, Nabil. Yeah, I mean, a few panels I could dream about like this. I have been hoping to set up this panel for a very long time. Rebecca and I have known one another for a very long time. We worked together when she did responsibility-driven design. I did use case-driven design. Now use cases and user stories are very good friends, so it's still going on. Rebecca and I have been developing UML together. UML is now very old, but still it inspires new work in this direction. We have been at conferences together on panels. I remember we were on a panel where there were 2,000 people, and we talked about, is it time to get the standard in modeling? And we have also danced together, actually, to the amusement of a lot of people at the conference. Joseph is a fantastic guy. I mean, he is not only an agilista, but he's also a psychologist. And as we all know, Agile is very much dependent on social engineering, social interaction. And that spin to Agile is fresh and something we definitely need to think about. So I'm really very much looking forward to that. What we don't know so much is that this guy has actually been CTO of eBay, something he doesn't want to talk too much about, but he has friends like me that talk about it. So, and Steve is a more new acquaintance to me, but I have heard about his work, particularly in test-driven development, and the inspiration he has given to many agile teams. So I hope you look forward to this panel as much as I do. It will be definitely very interesting. So yeah, about myself, a few words. I mean, maybe some people know who I am, but I can say that once upon a time, I was very interested in methodologies, and I still am. But at that time, I had my own method. It's called RAP. But after that, I saw one pattern that I actually couldn't stand, namely the war between methods and war between methodologists, which are gurus. Having guru in an industry like ours is just nuts, to use a modest word. And since then, I've been fighting against these crazy things. And essence is one of the one component that people who have similar interests have worked on for 15 years. So I'm very much looking forward to hear what the people say about that. Anyway, time to lead back to Nabil.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eva, for those lovely words. Okay, introductions are done. Let's get on to the meat of tonight. So I'll be asking our lovely panelists a few questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing their answers. At the end, we'll have some time for an audience Q&A, so don't worry. You'll also have your opportunity to ask questions. Feel free to use the chat while we go, and if you could, please try to remain muted to minimize disturbance. Okay, so new dog, old tricks. That's the theme of tonight. First question, I'm going to aim this question at you, Joseph. In your work with methods over all of these years, how do you think essence could help your audience?
Okay, first, I'm not a methodologist, nor do I play one on television. Many years ago, Steve told me a quote that I carry with me and think about mainly every day. And it's a quote from Eric Holford that says that every great cause starts as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. And that's where we are with Agile. Looking back, the fact that when Agile started becoming a business, and people started seeing it as a way to earn money, they started looking for differentiators. And the big problem that they had in differentiating their methods was making them, they were less descriptive and more prescriptive, to say that, oh, you must do this. Besides the fact that saying, you know, that doing the method is not the end in itself. It's not the goal, right? You don't get a badge if you do Scrum. But this is the problem, that there are so many variants of Scrum. There's competition and wars between Scrum and Kanban and whatever. Because also when methods become more prescriptive, they become by definition less agile. And what I was looking for was some way to say, look, there must be some things that they have in common. There must be some way to get these methods to work together. And in order to do that, you need to approach them from a different way, than a more holistic way than just saying, oh, I do this version of Scrum. And this is something I found in essence was essentially a step back or a step to a meta level, saying that, what are we actually trying to do? And then saying, okay, if we want to do this, how there are multiple ways of implementing this. And they're actually, if we view things from that point of view, we can actually find ways to get some of the practices from the different methods to work together. And that's where I see the promise in this. That's enough.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Rebecca or Steve, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to talk about. Having been involved in, like, I was experience report chair for the first Agile Development Conference in Salt Lake City. And I remember back then, people were, when they were writing of their Agile experiences, they were apologizing for breaking what a particular method was. Oh, I didn't do all of the XP practices. I'm sorry, I did this particular practice instead. Oh, we had a code review because we broke our website and now we've decided anything is, you know, so they were kind of like apologetic for adapting the methods of the early days. And that actually changed a couple of years later, fortunately, when people started saying, if you're doing XP practices the same way a year from now than you are today, then you're not doing XP. And so the idea, and I think Essence supports this with composability and adaptation of practices. If you're doing the same thing over and over again without learning an adaptation to your environment, you're not growing. So to me, the nature of becoming better at the way we work is reflection, adaptation, and evolution based on what we see that works. And so to me, that's really important.
Mm-hmm. I don't really have a lot to say on this one because I'm pretty new to Essence. It makes a lot of sense what I've seen from it so far, and I know Joseph talks about it being transformational for what he's seen, and it makes sense because it again is like the common language, building a common language so we can at least understand each other and maybe figure out what we're trying to do. And I'm thinking about the Hoffer book. The quote it's from a different book, but the book I usually go for is one called The True Believer, which sort of tracks how a good idea turns into something less good. But I was also remembering something that Chris Matz talks about, which is the community of needs versus community of solutions. And we were community of needs. We've got stuff we want to do. We need to figure out how we're going to do it. And having a set of, I guess it's like RRC cards for methods. A set of pieces that we can put together sounds like a fine idea, rather than the community of solutions, which is here's your guaranteed best practice, thing that you can just impose on your organization. That'll be just fine. So I haven't done it yet, but I can see the promise.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Okay, why don't we go on to the next question?
Well, David, if you don't mind. Well, I wanted to say one thing that not mentioned. Once you create something like Essence, a common ground that can be used to describe any method, you become surprised. We were surprised of how much more we could do, something we never expected to happen. One of the most challenging thing we have with methods is that every methodologist teach a method or write books about the method or websites or training, whatever. But once people have got that, the learning, past the learning cycle and has to go, they have to go and do the job, they start to scratch their head. What does the method say I should do? Or what does the practice say I should do? That's how people generally think. I call that the Achilles heel of method adoption, because we have no support. The only support we have for that is coaches. But reality is we don't have so many coaches that are good. And the ones who are good, they shouldn't spend time on teaching trivial things, because the transition from learning to doing is not a big step. So they shouldn't have to teach that step. But the essence, due to the language, can be activated. Practice can be activated, and that way supported. That is actually the biggest surprise to me once we started to work with Essence, that we could do something that we have had as a problem with all methods in all times. I don't know what you think about that, but I want to bring it up.
So underlying any I'm going to say out of the box methodology, and I am not a methodologist, but last week at DDD Europe, I gave a keynote with Matthias Wurst about how to critically engage with any sort of model. But understanding any model involves understanding the intentions and what it wants to focus on. And so if you look at any of the out-of-the-box agile methodologies that were there, they come with a set of practices. They have an underlying set of values and principles, and they take a point of view on certain things. And one of the things I think that Essence opens up the possibility for is if let's say that someone asked the question, is DAD, discipline agile delivery, how similar? If the authors themselves have not essence-sized their particular methodology, that you could take the various elements of disciplined agile delivery, for example, and turn it into comparing what those practices are and perhaps teasing out the underlying values behind them. Most agile methods have good intentions, but they focus on certain things. So Kanban is about flow, right? And visibility of what's blocking me. If you talk about team topologies, which is something that's a hot topic these days, it's talking about how do teams communicate and how do they support the value stream. So again, I'm just saying that looking at methods with a critical eye to what they care about and what you care about is important to understanding all of this.
This is something I totally support, also from a psychological point of view. Korzybski once said the map is not the territory. It's a very important statement because any map is an opinionated, subjective representation of what the map maker thinks to be important. And when you start looking more in the direction of assessments, be they agile assessments or whatever, the problem with that, with these, is that any assessment that you have says more about the person who wrote it than the person who took it. And actually, I remember a psychometrics class at university where the professor came in with a bunch of business assessments. You could really do the same thing with agile assessment. Came with a bunch of business assessments and said, your task for this hour is to figure out what are these people trying to sell. That was an eye-opener.
So I wouldn't be so, I'm not sure everyone wants to sell something so much as their intention is, this is what's important. Mm-hmm. And it may not be just to make money. I'm saying XP, for example, is a set of practices that the XP practitioners believed in, they were not really good at monetizing it. So
Yes, agree.
Yeah, I think the comparison with team topologies is very interesting because team topologies doesn't tell you what your organization should look like, but it says these are the common components of, these are some common components with it. And I found it a very useful way of being able to talk about organizational structure in a way that hadn't really been clear, at least not to me before that. So I can see it as being very similar.
So, for example, team topologies doesn't particularly talk about anything about how do we learn as an organization. Whereas if you look at the Spotify model for organization structure, they had chapters and guilds, for example, as an explicit building block. The building blocks are things that you should be able to, grab from various methods. They call you to action, they support certain values. But then again, you have to say, well, is that really my problem? Is it solving my problem? If not, I need to compose something else. And if I put all these things together, I need to be able to explain them. So
thank you for sharing your thoughts. Are we okay to move on to the next question?
Yeah.
We were still on the first question. Wow. Okay.
No. Great. I mean, I'd say we answered several questions, but yeah, according to my list on the first one. But so I would like to get your thoughts on, so Agile made respectable the idea of building for now with support for ongoing change in a system rather than trying to build for the future. Doing this safely, however, requires skill and effort, and there has inevitably been a backlash. Where do you see the balance between focusing on the immediate need and designing for the future? Perhaps, Steve, you could make a thought on this?
Well, the inevitable answer is it depends. I think part of what I was thinking about with this was that, again, it's a generational thing, but the great revelation of the early Agile movement was that we could actually defer decisions that traditionally had been prerequisites for even getting started. And the convention we used was, one of the conventional examples was, traditionally most projects would start with a 3 to 6 month argument about which database to use before you'd written a line of code, and arm wrestling the vendors. And that turned into, well, let's just use a flat file for now while we figure out what we need. And that was a huge shift, especially when in a lot of organizations there weren't any choices anyway. And what we're seeing now, of course, is 10, 20 years later that the cloud is sort of has pushed that onto the same sort of thing as steroids, because you don't even have to order kit, and you don't have to order figure out how you're going to do services, because you're bolting together, binding together a number of services that other people are looking at, that other people provide. One of the things to remember with that is that, and one of the things about that is, one of the things to remember about that is it does rely on a number of people providing very solid infrastructure that can do that, provide you with that infrastructure safely and reliably, and such that you can depend on it. And it also depends on reflective practice, so that when the demands on your system change, maybe you get successful, great, that you can actually follow where you need to go. But I still see a lot of places where the effort in making any decisions at all is so high that, large institutions, that you do tend to jam everything in just in case, because the cost of change, which, the XP phrase, the cost of change is so high that you can't afford to respond to circumstances. So I suspect, as always, the balance depends far more these days on the organizational culture than anything technical. Provided you have the skills to recognize when those transition moments happen, and that you have the skills to follow, and the infrastructure, and the tests, and the all the development practice that allows you to pivot safely without driving the system into a ditch.
One thing that I would like to point out, and this might be a bit heretical, also because nobody talks about this, is about the one change in XP. Back when we started doing this at Chrysler in 1996, that was for a failed project that they needed to get up and running. That was a certain context that was in, and that context is essentially that what Steve is saying. Now, after Kent left Chrysler and came over to Europe, and I worked with him, the projects we were working on there, this was about the beginning of the first internet bubble. And the first interesting thing with the first internet bubble was these were the first internet startups that said, okay, let's build something lightweight. And if we get through IPO, we'll throw it away and we'll build it again. And that's something that people tend to forget, is the fact to say, okay, let's build it right. Let's make sure we don't make any bad decisions to paint ourselves into a corner, but realizing that all we need to do is get enough up and running to prove to the potential investors that we can do this, but then we might need to do something else to build something that's very stable. And what happened is that a lot of the, I don't want to call them prototypes, but a lot of the lightweight implementations that we had back then essentially did go into production, and they weren't scalable. And this is a situation I dealt with at eBay and with probably other companies. And Steve, you probably went through that, the same thing. And I think what's important is to look back at this historical context of it. You know, this was sufficient. You know, Kent used to say that, look, one of the greatest things about the internet is that people are used to crappy UIs. And how far did that get us now? Yeah.
So I have another, I don't know what the feedback's going on here, but I'm hearing stuff in my ears. So I have another take on this about focusing on immediate need versus designing for the future. Mm-hmm. It depends on what the hell you're building. And if I'm in a startup and I don't have any, let's say, I don't mind making money for a while, I can do one thing. If I'm creating products or adding to products that are well-known in the marketplace, I do other things. Not everyone is Netflix, you know, so it depends really on the nature of what you're building and doing. And I tend to think that a model for looking at that, and again, I think Kent Beck has said something that is his 3X model, is an interesting way of looking at where a particular effort that you're doing is. Are you in the explore phase? Are you in the expand phase? Or are you in the extract value in the market phase? And I mean, that's a rough generalization of, you know, talking about, you know, a dimension of what you do and how much upfront you're doing. If you're in that explore phase and you can afford to throw it away and start again once you start expanding, that's great. But sometimes it isn't just a smooth transition. So anyway, it depends on what you're doing and the risk and the livelihood that you're doing. So, you know, upfront work for NASA flying, absolutely. Although it's interesting that even NASA and JPL folks have been doing agile in their way for some time.
Well, do you remember one of the early poster childs was Medtronics, I think?
Oh yeah,
yeah. So it was doing safety critical but agile. I mean, I used to work on shrink wrap. You know, you hit the print date, and and they printed all the discs, so it it damn well had to be right on the day. And there was no easy mechanism for fixing it in production. But I've also been in again, one of my better projects was we had a internal system, we had a little system, we did that we shipped fortnightly, we could have shipped every day, but around us we were surrounded by grossly over-architected systems where everything was configurable, because configuration is not programming, right? And where their release cycle was 6 to 9 months if you were lucky, because it was impossible it was extremely difficult to figure out what you'd done to the system when you changed that configuration, because they hadn't, because they'd gone for what they thought was a future-proof design, and had actually just painted themselves into a corner.
Thank you for
and
sharing.
Those still exist. There's still people doing that.
So it's interesting you mentioned Medtronic, because just for the audience here, and I spent some time at Medtronic talking about, does it has to be agility versus reliability? I remember spending time in their research lab and whatever. But one of the things that John Spence, who brought agile practices into Medtronic, as he said, first things we have to align agile practices that we want to do with our company's values. And so, in fact, he says we can't bring the manifesto in and shake our fists at the engineering excellence that we have, but we can do things like have managed backlogs and do things more incrementally. So anyway, the point is that the context really matters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. So another question for you guys. Agile has a long history and has existed even before the term agile was coined. What are some early practices or techniques that you thought were helpful that have since been forgotten or surpassed? So maybe just some quick fire answers about what you guys are thinking in this area. Maybe Joseph, if we could hear.
Sorry, the first thing that comes to mind that I miss is the silly integration hat.
Maybe a brief description about what that is.
Well, way back when you had the gold standard integration machine, right? And when somebody was going to commit code and do the integration, they went over to that machine and they normally put on a funny hat. And at that time, everyone else knew that the code was integrating and you might as well stop development because you're going to have to merge afterwards anyway. And just these funny little rituals that we had. And the fact of then people starting hacking things like, okay, this was before Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, but I remember a team actually going out and finding a broken down street light and hacking that onto the integration machine to show what the build status was. And doing things like that, which, okay, this, I guess I'm sounding like an old guy thinking about the good old days, but these were things that I remember that really motivated teams. Okay, how can we take this and do it in a way that's actually then fun for us?
So I'm going to mention one practice, reading code, just for the sake of reading code to understand things. These days, I think that Agile has, and we use a lot of open source software. We look at frameworks and whatever, but we're just looking at the APIs, but we're not reading code as much as we used to. Reading code in the environments that I come from is a great way of, so it's not like I'm not doing anything, but rather than just searching in my favorite IDE, or maybe I'm using Vim, so I'm just doing massive grep, rather than just finding something, but actually taking the time to read code.
Yeah, it's just following that, and I think it's going to be an interesting trend now as everyone's supposed to be going serverless. There's hardly any code there even when you find it, because the system is now soup of collective stuff, rather like, I'm going to mention this. I'm going to be the first one to mention small talk tonight. But the soup of tiny little methods, nobody really knows what they do. So I think that's a shift that's going to be interesting to watch. My early agile practice, and this is triggered by a talk that a colleague of mine, Keith Braithwaite, some of you know, gave recently at Minispa in the UK. That one of the things I think we have lost, or many teams have lost, is this resetting of the balance between delivery and need. And the notion that the people doing the technical side, delivery, whatever you want to call them, actually both have a stake in the result and can contribute to the result. And that, you know, this idea of entrepreneurial teams who will figure out, you give them a problem rather than a requirement, and that they will collectively figure out what the best route through is. And you see an awful lot of what is supposed to be agile, which is sort of this feature factory, that you shovel requirements at them at one end and code comes out at the other end, and they just do what they're told with metrics. And I think that's a huge thing that's been lost, which is very unfortunate.
One thing I see, getting back about small talk, Diana mentioned something. I tend to go and look at parent classes and their implementation. Does anyone else still do this? Yes, this is something I learned to do in small talk, which was really a problem when I started working in, for example, in C# in Visual Studio, and all that code was hidden. Is one thing that I learned from people like Rebecca and Kent and stuff, is to look at those methods and figure out what is the smallest possible change you need to do to subclass a method implementation from that. And yeah, that's one of the problems that I found in other languages that hid their libraries.
Yeah, so if you're using open source, don't just look at the APIs. I mean, I read the code to understand. I remember seeing recently on the internet or in Twitter, someone complaining that, and they wrote a blog post about this. Wow, I just discovered in React that you can do this particular different kind of event processing. And I'm going, yeah. He discovered it after programming it in a year. And so it's almost like in this hurry to get our jobs done, we don't get comfortable and play around with what we're using.
I think that there's sorry, just to riff on this. I think there's another failure mode, which is the agile team's going, if I'm not typing, stuff of a code of value to the business right now, then we're all going to die. So we're all wasting our time. And it's no, you need a bit of slack. You need to be able to do stuff. And it's possible that one of the great contributions to Java was once you go to a JVM, you can decompile stuff. Half a chance of figuring out what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so what's interesting in the original mob programming, which now has, another name for it is ensemble programming that Woody Zoll introduced to the world, is that they spend an hour a day learning things together rather than producing the next feature. And Hunter folks are pretty, I won't say dogmatic, because I don't like that word, but pretty conscientious about continuing to do that even today.
So Rebecca, I have a question for you just on what you mentioned around mob programming, and now it's called ensemble programming. So, we've seen people reinvent the wheel, or perhaps sometimes they just rebrand the wheel in order to create something new. Have you observed any of these reinventions or rebrandings, and are they actually helping us, or are we perhaps losing something with each new iteration of the thing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think everyone when they are new to something likes to think that it's new. And I tend to think that what happens when things get rebranded, and I'm going to say, is that sometimes the essence of the nuances of the other practices fall away. So if I think about it, test driven development is a brand that says, oh, I must be, if you follow it dogmatically, red, green, refactor, right? Go through those cycles. But that kind of left out, gee, we might want to do some sketching or some playing around in the code.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's just a very simple example of, oh, is it okay to do this? You know, because it gets distilled down to the small cycle.
Yeah. But I must say, in defense of that, when we started doing it, Rebecca, a lot of us who were doing it implicitly had or intuitively had that mindset in there because we were all strongly influenced by you.
Well,
so we didn't do it so explicitly, but we said we all had the same mindset when we started out. But
well, so the thing is once something gets rebranded and practiced over time, when you don't have that sort of context, is that it sort of gets whittled down to the very basics. And I remember in the early days, even people saying, here's the TDD cycle. They had trouble even doing their demos on the code, you know, live on stage, exactly doing it that way. Oh, I should have run the test first. So if you're being dogmatic about something, that sort of loses the nuances of it. But I think that will happen to any sort of method or practice over time.
Well, we've been through enough of those cycles. And
Yeah.
part of it is, you know, to get the word out, you have to simplify the message.
Do you?
Which is, well, or let me say, the message is commonly that's commonly done.
If you don't do it, someone else will simplify it. Yeah. I'm just saying the Agile Manifesto is a great example. You talk about, while we favor these on the left, we favor these on the right-hand side more. And so those values, people shorten it to no documentation, no this. So I tend to think, even if you put the words around it, people will simplify it.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, so some of the technical stuff is I look at microservices and, well, but more particularly serverless, and I'm thinking, you know, the original object model, you know, it's Erlang, if you like, and the way some stuff. And the other one is, you know, sore point for me is, you know, mocks are dead, mocks are terrible, mocks are thing, you know, can't use mocks. Oh, but you're doing consumer-driven contracts. That looks awfully like the same.
Yes,
exactly.
Right.
How is that different?
Yeah.
So that's my bitterness coming out. It's
yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Mocks are something that I have great use for it sometime, and people will go, oh, that's just a bad practice, and it's like understanding the contract is kind of important.
Sorry.
So, taking a slightly more forward-looking approach, what new tricks have you discovered or are learning about that excite you? Maybe Joseph, we could hear from you.
I'll pass on that for right now. I need to think about it, because most of my focus right now is just more on the people side than on the technical side.
No problem at all. Rebecca or Steve, what do you think?
Do you want to go?
Sure.
I'll go. Oh no, you go.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
All right. So, very early days, but I've sort of dabbled in it and no degree of expertise whatsoever. But I've become interested in the application of model checking, some degree of formal methods, because it seems like there's been a sea change, and that the tooling has got cheap enough, if you like, or the kit has got powerful enough that the tooling doesn't matter anymore. And there are a couple of things. There seems to be a bit of a groundswell, and also I suspect that, again, once you start to look at cloud and distributed systems, and everything's in little bits and pieces, that it becomes much more difficult to prove that something works by testing. So I have precious little evidence, but I'm kind of model checking curious.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Steve.
Sorry.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts? What are you discovering and learning that really excites you?
Well, a couple of things that I've been sort of exploring over the last few years is the relationship between patterns and design heuristics that we come up with. And that I realized that patterns authors wrote about what they saw, right, as good practices. There are always alternative ways of doing things. And the work of Billy von Cohn, and I'll type that name into the chat here so that people can know what I'm talking about, basically says that and he wrote about heuristics in engineering practices, is there's always a plausible way forward, but there's no guarantees. And so we each have our own heuristics that we apply. And for example, even when you look at the patterns of a particular system that's been implemented, those were perhaps what was known at that time. But today, we have other practices, and there are also many other options for design choices that other people have done that they didn't take the time to write patterns. So I tend to think that looking at and finding heuristics is a really great way, and not just to look for pattern sources for good ideas. You can go to conferences and you see 6 options for updating an event store that should be immutable. And you go, well, what are the heuristics behind that, and why are they making these choices? So anyway, that's something I'm doing, is finding more options. Let's just not look at the baked in patterns that people talked about.
I think that's interesting, because I guess one of the problems I had with the whole patterns hype and everything is the implicit assumption that there is one right way.
Oh no.
and
Yeah.
that let's say that applies in certain domains. But once again, say, what are the heuristics that we're looking at? Say that, yes, there are a number of potential approaches that we can do. And what are the trade-offs, and what are we looking for, taking that extra step? I think,
and it may not even work. And so you have to be able to back up and retreat if you're making an important kind of decision. And we do that all the time. Yeah. So, I mean, behind any sort of well-known pattern, like let's say an aggregate or whatever, it is a million different details that we might want to consider on how to implement it.
I mean, that's why, in prehistory, when I used to do a lot of conferences, I used to follow your lead and focus on the experience reports, because they were the most interesting, because they were the ones where they, on the whole, weren't trying to sell me something. If they were properly curated.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
And in fact, when I was sort of doing program reviewing, it was always, and what went wrong. It was a requirement for an experience report.
Yep. And what did I try next? Yeah, right.
Yeah,
that's the difference between sharing an experience, actually, and writing a case study that's like we used to call those white papers. Nothing, of course, ever went wrong. We were always on the true path, but life isn't like that.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, I ended up going to an evening event, which was colloquially called a fuck-up night.
Oh, yeah.
Where they had 4 people come in, or it was essentially people who tried to do startups and businesses, to explain where they fucked up and what they learned from it and what they're now doing differently. And I think that was very, the audience was very open for that. And I think that it was very beneficial for people. And I'd really be interested to see that at agile conferences. I'd be interested to see the big consultancies doing things like that. But but I thought that was just such a great idea. Say, okay, this is.
So you need a meetup to start a meetup, Joseph, like that, and we'll all come because we'll learn a lot.
Yeah.
I did once. Sorry, I did once try to run one of those sessions at Spa in the UK a long time ago, a mea culpa session, and nobody turned up. So you have to have the right circumstances.
It's interesting because I, with Ray Arel at the Agile Open Northwest, it's an open space event that we used to have in person, and for the last couple of years it's been virtual. We had a session like that about what did you do and how did you recover from it. There were a few people that went to that event. It was interesting in that these stories were really great, but people said, well, but we can't really talk about those outside of this room.
Yeah. So what does that say about this, this field? That we can't learn from our mistakes, we can't admit to it. And this gets back, sorry, into the whole, I hate using the buzzword psychological safety, but the whole thing with medical teams and stuff like that, the best ones are the ones who admit to it and say, we learn this from it.
Yeah, but sorry.
No, I was just agreeing, and it was
okay.
About how ironic it is that, you know, so much of Agile we focus on retrospectives and improving and discussing what goes wrong, and yet people can be quite adverse to a fuck up meetup, which I am totally in favor of, by the way.
Well, if you have one, I might go.
There you go, an idea for our next event. We've got several minutes left, and I'm keen to get the audience involved because I know I've seen several questions in the chat, but I thought we could spend the next few minutes fielding questions from the audience. So I'll look at the chat. While I do that, if you do have a question, feel free to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. That'll make it a bit easier. But to get us started, why don't we, I saw a nice detailed question from Alexander Voss. If you want to unmute and ask your question, feel free to. Otherwise, I can ask on your behalf.
Sorry, hi there. I was kind of listening to the conversation, and it all seemed to be still quite centered on the business of writing the software. So in essence terms, I think that's the software system and the way of working alpha, the things that the people writing code touch most. And I was wondering about all the other alphas that I found very useful, and that I thought were very good that Essence was bringing them back into view, like things like stakeholder involvement. Just a couple of things why I mention this. One is because I've recently left my job at St. Andrews teaching software engineering, and I'm recasting myself as a freelancer. And I'm currently trying to help a smallish company that isn't traditionally software heavy to build their first software heavy product. I'm kind of being landed right in the middle of a project where the requirements engineering is the major problem. So I'd like to hear more about that. And the other one is that I'm currently writing a paper about software engineering and human rights, because I have a hunch that the focus on these kind of more strictly technical matters are actually a bit of a regression in software engineering. And I don't know if people know Ian Somerville, but he was the person who I inherited the modules from at St. Andrews. And he has this wonderful textbook. Is he around? I shouldn't say too much about it, but you know, it's quite heavy going stuff. But it was written in a way that was kind of very long lasting. You know, you can read some of the old editions, and a lot of the stuff that's in there is still very valid. And he's since published a new book on building software products, which is noticeably thinner. It's got more on Agile, but well, it's got none of the stuff that I actually cared about in his old book. I'll shut up now, because I think I have kind of asked a question, given a bit of background.
So I'm a great one for thinking about the complete cycle of understanding products. And I follow a lot of people who are in that product definition, UX, user-centered design space as well. And it's interesting to me that in our focus on delivery and flow, that, for example, that kind of effort is not in team topologies, for example. And I'm going, why isn't that sort of team part of the flow, right, of ideas and understanding and feedback. So I tend to think that there is a lot of techniques out there. I certainly encourage them when I'm going out there. At the DDD conference I was at last week, yeah, there were people in the audience doing that sort of stuff for a living and talking about it as keynotes. But in the agile space, it's sort of like been de-emphasized, and I don't know why.
I think it might be partly in the nature of who, you know, the members of the panel, if you like, because I'm certainly on that side of the fence at the moment. I would say, you know, and Ian Somerville was my external examiner, so I know who he is. I would also say that, and I did spend, during that time, I spent a lot of time hanging around with user-centered design people and the rest of it. But I would refer back to the point I was making earlier, which is one of the things that got lost, is this tight relationship between needs and delivery, which, and it's a shame that it's sort of all sort of, it seems to be cut off, and part of the symptom, one of the symptoms, I guess, of that is that you know, we get to talk about all this technical stuff, and we're not really allowed to think about that other stuff because that's somebody else's problem. So I know, yeah, I take your point. It's one last thing is but there is also a bit which is, you know, you can only do so much, and we do need specialists in the different areas. So, you know, someone has to ship the code eventually, and someone has to know how to do that. And covering the whole thing, which I often end up doing, that's an awful lot to cover. Joseph.
I have raised my hand.
Oh, sorry, it's on.
I was going to say, Ivar's been patiently waiting. Please.
Sorry. I can't see that.
You know, the question you raised about essences for software engineering, that is true, and that was a very conscious decision when we started to work on Essence, because if we're not successful with software, we won't be successful with anything else. So, but the Essence has been used for system engineering, even for innovation products. You don't really know what it is, so it can be anything. For instance, Scrum is essentialized, and Scrum is not nowadays only for software, it's for any project basically. But there is work now going on in, you know, Essence is an international standard. It's OG has sponsored it and adopted it, so it's an OG standard. But there is now work going on to make Essence more generic. So it's basically about any engineering effort or product. And that's a very small work, because most of the alphas, as you mentioned, will still be there in the kernel alphas. The software system alpha will be, I believe, a system alpha, and can be anything. So that is happening as we speak, actually.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I mean, Alexander, I think you got a pretty robust response from a few people, so hopefully that satisfies you. Any other questions? Would anyone like to unmute and ask a question from the audience? We have Mike. Would you feel free to unmute and ask a question? Lovely beard, by the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Maybe a little bit less of a question and more just a topic of conversation. So certainly when I started off, thanks to Ivar, I started off with RUP. And then, of course, the company I was working for decided RUP was a little too prescriptive and heavy, and we went into agile. I've seen UML come and then get replaced by, for example, user stories. And yet more recently, it's been interesting to me. Grady Bush has been talking a lot about UML still. I certainly think that it has, at times, it's certainly applicable and a good way of illustrating certain things. Dave Snowden advocates for using waterfall under certain problem domains. And so I wonder whether we get rid of things just a little too quickly rather than using them appropriately. Just wondering what you guys think.
I think that's kind of the nature of our business. And it's kind of unfortunate that it's like shiny new thing obviates, or, you know, our collective memory goes away. One of the things that I find fascinating is the growth of people doing software development. And if you think about the half-life of doubling of people every 5 years, well, UML is like 5 generations ago. and so we also, so that's one factor that's going on. But another thing that happens is that when we're adopting something, it's the case that we like to be leading edge, whatever that might be, just in our industry. And so it's not like we have material scientists, material engineers, mechanical engineers have a set of things that they believe and know and practice, even though the materials technology changes. And we're not in an engineering discipline, I don't think, just aren't. And so those values of what's new, you know, shiny new toys, obviates everything we've done before is kind of, so I challenge those who are responsible for these software engineering practices to kind of make them more relevant to people that are just starting.
And a couple of responses. One is, actually, one of the striking things about the industry is how much of it appears to be stuck in 1976. We're still using Unix. And I remember seeing a talk from Tim Roscoe, I think at ETH, about how if you look at a modern processor, you know, you've got this, you know, a bazillion chips on it, and then about this much is the bit that makes it look like Unix, and the rest of the processors are all doing something else, mostly simulation to pretend. And we're trapped in this world where we can't get out of that. So in many respects, we're less adventurous, ironically less adventurous than we ought to be, given the power of the machinery that we're sitting on top of. The other thing I would say is that I think one thing we have seen, and we've certainly seen through multiple cycles, is that by the time we get to the large companies, they always do what they were going to do anyway. You know, whatever you throw at them, it turns into the same thing. And it happened, you know, I remember object centers of excellence and all that stuff, and client server centers of excellence and XML centers of excellence, and it always turns into the same soup because that's where the money is. And I'm pretty sure that early RUP was much more flexible and lightweight than what it turned into.
Oh, it was always configurable.
Well, that's a separate problem. But the greatest very early stuff was very simple, except the kind of sort of agile with pictures. And then it turned into this monster stuff. I also remember having an exchange with a rational consultant, trying to get the difference between XP and RUP. You know, where is the boundary between XP and RUP? And there wasn't one, because whatever you wanted, you could have one of those.
So I guess that's a problem with, and I'll let Ivar speak after this, but I think beware of agile practices that are like flypaper for picking up anything without thinking about how they compose.
Yeah,
and I've seen that trend in, I will say, some methodologies, I'm not going to mention names here, but if you're looking at version 5.2 or 3 that has all these now new things, how do they fit together is the real question.
XP and RAP were to large extent just complementary. XP had practices that we never considered in RAP. RAP was a technical, more cared about technical stuff and not so much about the team. Whereas XP brought in an agile, brought in social engineering to the equation and made a huge difference.
Yeah.
But that one coach that Steve, or that one
this is more a commentary, but it's more about,
didn't agree with that.
No, it's not so much that. It's more about, that was more a comment about the nature of consultancy than any particular methodology at the time.
Joseph, I think you wanted to say something, or?
No, I'm just enjoying listening.
Microphone mute up. Thank you so much for that.
Nabil, sorry, could I just come back with a really quick one?
Quick one.
Something Rebecca said to me strikes true, and I think that with all of these things is bad implementation and good implementation. And I think, Rebecca, what you said about we're no longer engineers, and I hope I haven't misquoted you, I think is true. And what I'm hearing from a lot of people who have been in the industry for a long time, it's exactly that. It's good, solid engineering practices and know-how and possibly experience that goes with that. And I'm wondering whether a lot of the things that we get these days are too plastic and too, rinse and reuse, rather than having a core understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and then using appropriate tools, practices, methodologies. So yeah, I just wanted to agree with you. I think what you said was spot on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you for the question, Mike. It's triggered a very interesting conversation. We're at 10 past. I'll just check with Eva to see if there's anything you'd like to add or any areas we haven't explored before we wrap up.
Well, there are many areas we haven't explored. So, no, I think it was a very interesting discussion. And it was fresh as tomorrow, which I really appreciate. So no, I can just say thank you very much to all participants, and I have followed the questions quite a lot, and there are many great questions. So I don't know, Nabil, if you can in any way save them and make them available to us.
Absolutely, I can save the questions as in a chat file and share it.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Beautiful. And I know there were some questions about how to get more involved with Essence. Ivar pasted his email address, and it's pretty easy to find if you look at his LinkedIn profile, for example. So if you are curious about Essence, he would more than welcome a conversation or an email.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, this is where I do my very awkward virtual round of applause. So thank you very much for my lovely panelists for a very insightful conversation. Feel free to unmute and join me. There we go.
Thank you.
Hey.
Have a nice evening, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Very much, Joseph, Rebecca, Stephen, and of course, Eva, and the audience for tuning in. Hopefully you found it insightful.